Hi, I'm David Bell. At the heart of church life, there has to be goodwill. A Christian delight in other people and their journey through life. At the heart of Methodism is a deep sense of toleration, as John Wesley called it, Catholic spirit, meaning willingness to walk with another Christian despite apparent differences of opinion or doctrine. And certainly Methodists breathe the atmosphere of justice and fair play for all. Yet this isn't always easy to achieve, and in this episode of Through the Year with John Wesley, we look at how one outstanding New Zealand leader did it, and how we might also do it by drawing upon his thought. The person is Eric Hames, an ordained presbyter and a character of no mean repute in the New Zealand church scene. He held many positions. He's most famous for being the acting principal of Trinity Theological College from 1941 to 44, and then principal from 45 to 62. He was also a president of the conference and chairman of the Auckland Methodist district. In many respects, the church at regional and national level in Hames' era was more, not less complicated than now. More was required, more was expected in any kind of national leadership position. The ability of the church to communicate with its ordinary members and its willingness to take feedback in and modify ideas was far stronger then than it is today. Despite having all the techniques of social media and instant communication, our church is paralysed compared to what Hames characterised as the decade of innocence, the 1950s. Communication was fine back then. And back then the Theological College was an important driver of denominational identity, but the range and diversity of church life brought other factors into play. In fact, the changes required for theological education were very wide and far-reaching. The influx of candidates had served as military personnel in World War II. The pressures for acceptance of married candidates and women candidates loomed large. And by the 1960s, the seeds had been sown for a deeper, more radical theological revision. Hames had been in a unique position of influence as principal and Auckland District Chairman and President of Conference. So when the time came for the 150th anniversary of New Zealand Methodism, he was well prepared to publish something of significance. He'd long since retired as principal, having served for 22 years. Another principal, Dr. J.J. Lewis, wrote of him, quote, "Warmth of humanity, deep understanding of life, and perception and judgment mark his leadership," unquote. He also had a self-deprecating sense of humour. He had been presented with a leather satchel at a function, and he quipped that it would help keep his sermons dry. The church had wisely divided the labours of scholarship for the 150th among a group of 3 outstanding presbyters. They were called ministers back then, I should add. These were Eric Hames, who was to write Volume 2, The History of the Colonial Church from 1840 to 1913, and a third volume on the church from 1914 to 72. The redoubtable George I. Lawrenson was to write Volume 1, The History of Te Hahiweteriana, that is, the history of the Māori Church and the missions pre-1840. The equally remarkable George Carter wrote Volume 4 about the New Zealand missions into the Pacific. Together, the trio produced an account of New Zealand Methodism at depth. Like all histories, there were errors and omissions, yet these don't in any way diminish the achievement. History on this scale has to encompass social history, national history, church history, and more than a dash of intellectual history. What were the ideas? What were the controversies? What in the church was dying and what was springing into renewal? Hames was, in my opinion, an acute enough observer, a wise enough pastor with the discerning eye of a Wesleyan theologian to see that the currents of post-World War II thought did not necessarily augur well for the future of the church. Now, Volume 2 by Hames was called Out of the Common Way, but Volume 3, Coming of Age. In reality, the church wasn't so much coming of age, but rather taking leave of the age. The Gearing heresy trial in the late 1960s marked the beginning of the end of a liberal-minded Presbyterian church in this country. The effect of that trial and the controversial books from the 1960s, like Bishop John Robinson's Honest to God, mild by today, were felt in Trinity Theological College, not least by Principal Hames. I met him when I was a student, and he was one of the grand old men at the Remuera Church. I used to have some lively conversations with George Lawrenson and on occasion George Carter. But with Principal Hames it was just a little bit different. Just not quite as easy to be familiar. In a nutshell, he was one who had followed in Wesley's footsteps and, like Wesley, forged a remarkable vision, some of which made it into his books and pamphlets, but mostly lived in the hearts and minds of those to whom he was a pastor. Generations of students. So join me next week as we look at Dr. Susan Thompson's book, Knowledge and Vital Piety, for the next chapter. And thanks for watching.